Good evening. It is my delight to have you with us tonight for the launch of the Ohio-based Mobile Institute. The Public Theology and Racial Justice Collaborative of Vanderbilt Divinity School has been conducting these conversations and teachings around the country. And I am delighted to have so many wonderful leaders out of the Ohio state, people who are conscious, people who are woke, people who want to generate conversation that will move people to transformation. This evening, I'm delighted to have my dear friend and colleague with us, a young person who has taught me well throughout my career as an academic, and someone who I believe you will enjoy. The Reverend Howard W. Wiley is an ordained Baptist minister. He received his Bachelor of Arts degree in English from Kent State University in Kent, Ohio, and his Master of Divinity and Master of Philosophy degrees from Union Theological Seminary in New York City. Currently, he is a PhD candidate in Theology, Ethics, and the Human Sciences at Chicago Theological Seminary. His areas of concentration are Africana religious studies, theology of culture, and critical theory. The primary focus of his research and writing is the African-American tradition of interpreting the spirituals. A member of the faculty of Payne Theological Seminary in Wilberforce, Ohio for 10 years. As an assistant professor of systematic theology, he worked alongside the faculty and the administration of Payne to establish the seminary as one of the 6 fully accredited historically Black seminaries in the United States. He laid the foundation for Payne's curriculum in the field of systematic theology and served 1 year as interim dean of academic affairs. As adjunct professor of theology, Professor Wiley has taught MDiv and DMin graduate courses in systematic, liberation, constructive, and public theologies, philosophy, critical cultural and social theories, and Africana religious studies to students attending Bethany Theological Seminary and Earlham School of Religion in Richmond, Indiana, United Theological Seminary in Dayton, Ohio, the Center for African American Theological Studies in Chicago, Illinois, New Brunswick Theological Seminary in New Brunswick, New Jersey, and Methodist Theological School in Delaware, Ohio. He has also organized and conducted workshops, given lectures, and led seminars in undergraduate colleges and universities and in congregational and community settings that have engaged the interconnecting theological and public policy issues related to racial, gender, economic, and environmental justice. Over the course of his professional life and through the various periods of his academic preparation, Reverend Wiley has been involved in a wide range of civil rights, human rights, and social justice movements, from the Black Studies movement, anti-war and anti-apartheid movements, to the movements to free political prisoners, movements for Black political empowerment, and neighborhood movements for housing and the end of homelessness. At the core of his ministry, teaching, scholarship, and activism is the principal conviction that social transformation goes hand in hand with the transformation of consciousness. It is important to me that Reverend Howard Wiley is our moderator for the evening. He helped us handpick this wonderful scholar who will bring us our keynote address. And I hand it over now to Reverend Wiley.
Hello, everyone. I bring you greetings from Xenia, Ohio, the city of hospitality. And I want to wish everyone happy Earth Day. Before I introduce Dr. Joy Bostic, I want to thank Vanderbilt Divinity School and the Public Theology and Racial Justice Collaborative, which operates under the auspices of the Divinity School. And I also want to thank the director of the Public Theology and Racial Justice Collaborative, Dr. Emily Towns, and also give a very special word of appreciation to Dr. Teresa Smallwood for her outstanding work as Associate Director of the Public Theology and Racial Justice Collaborative. It is under her committed and skillful leadership that this Ohio Mobile Institute is taking place. And I want to say, because of her leadership and because of her openness to our input into the organizing of this program, I am excited to say that this is an all Ohio event. So what you will be experiencing and witnessing and hearing this weekend, tonight, on the two panels, tomorrow morning and tomorrow afternoon, and also a performance between the two panels, and then a talkback session on Saturday, are all people who reside in Ohio. They are scholars, preachers, pastors, teachers, community activists and community organizers, political activists and policymakers. And we are in for a wonderful weekend of engagement with the issues that are in the forefront of the leadership and the communities in Ohio. We have some phenomenal people, and it's going to be a phenomenal weekend. I am just overjoyed and delighted to have the honor and the privilege and the responsibility to introduce our keynote speaker for this evening. Before I enter into a formal introduction of Dr. Joy R. Bostic, I would like to give an informal introduction to give you some insight of the connection between Dr. Bostic that I have between Dr. Bostic, the connection that exists between Dr. Bostic and me. Both of us are alumni of Union Theological Seminary in New York. Dr. Bostic did her PhD work under the guidance of Dr. Dolores Williams, who was her advisor. And when I was doing my graduate studies at Union Theological Seminary in New York, Dr. James Combe was my advisor. And I mention this connection because I think it's important to note that we are standing on the shoulders of giants who have paved the way for and laid the foundation for the emergence of the theological movement that spoke to the survival and liberation of Black people in the United States and around the world. So that is an important note to consider as we listen to Dr. Bostic, and to know that we are representative of a very powerful and enduring legacy. A legacy that speaks in a very powerful way to the historical challenges of the time in which we now live. Dr. Joy R. Bostic is an associate professor in the Department of Religious Studies at Case Western Reserve University in Cleveland, Ohio, and the founding director of the minor in African and African American Studies. She's also a program faculty member of the Women's and Gender Studies and Ethnic Studies programs. And I have a very special announcement that is important for this gathering to be aware of, that I have Dr. Bostic's permission to share with you. And that is that she has recently been appointed as the inaugural Associate Dean for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion for the College of Arts and Sciences at Case Western Reserve University. She will assume that position in the Dean's office on July 1, 2021. Dr. Bostic is a Mellon Administrative Fellow and serves as a member of the steering committee for the Mysticism Unit of the American Academy of Religion. She is the author of several book chapters and scholarly articles on race, gender, and religion, and is the author of African American Female Mysticism, 19th Century Religious Activism, that was published by Macmillan in 2013. Dr. Bostic's forthcoming book, Performing Black Gods, Religion, Ritual, and Resistance in African American Popular Culture, explores religion, ritual, and race in visual culture, music, and dance. She is a member of the Transatlantic Roundtable on Religion and Race and is a co-editor of that organization's forthcoming volume, Black Religious Landscapes. Professor Bostic received a Bachelor of Arts in Philosophy from Indiana University and went on to earn a Juris Doctor and Master of Arts in Public Policy and Management from The Ohio State University. She attended Garrett Evangelical Theological Seminary, where she was awarded the Master of Divinity degree. And after graduating from seminary, she was ordained a Christian minister at Second Baptist Church in Evanston, Illinois. While attending Garrett Evangelical, she worked as a research assistant for the Religion in Urban America Project. And after leaving Garrett Evangelical, Reverend Bostic received her PhD. She entered Union Theological Seminary for continuing to continue her graduate studies, and received her PhD in systematic theology from Union Theological Seminary in the city of New York. And as I mentioned previously, she was a student of Dr. Dolores, a PhD student of Dr. Dolores Williams at that time when she was doing her PhD studies at Union. And Dr. Dolores Williams, a pioneer and a pathfinder in womanist theology, was her advisor. While in New York, she served as an associate minister at Second Canaan Baptist Church and a chaplain for the New York Liberty. She also taught courses in theology and religion as an adjunct professor at Fordham University, at Lincoln Center, and Auburn Seminary. And she was the coordinator of the Barnard Columbia Rape Crisis Anti-Violence Support Center and the executive director of the African American Task Force on Violence Against Women, a community-based organization that was based in Central Harlem. Dr. Bostic is an artist at heart. Professor Bostic is also a student of dance, photography, and the textile arts. So it is with delight and joy and great appreciation that I bring before you Dr. Joy R. Bostic to deliver the keynote address for this evening.
Thank you, my dear brother, Reverend Howard Wiley, and thank you so much for reminding me of our connection at Union Theological Seminary. I was and am a student of Dolores Williams and James Cone and Jim Washington and all of those who are part of that cloistered time when we are able to think and construct what it means to be theologians, ministers, who are working toward the healing, freedom, survival, and liberation of Black people. I too want to thank the Vanderbilt Public Theology and Racial Justice Collaborative. Thank you so much for this invitation, Dr. Smallwood. And I also want to recognize Dr. Emily Towns, who also was one of my teachers as I ran across her at Garrett Evangelical Theological Seminary. She actually was the one who advised me in terms of where I would go for my PhD education. I'm speaking to you from Cleveland, Ohio. And I first of all want to acknowledge the land upon which I reside and from which I am speaking tonight. I want to express gratitude and appreciation to those who lived and worked before us, those whose stewardship and resilient spirit makes our residence possible on this traditional land, homeland of the Lenape, the Shawnee, the Wyandotte, the Miami, the Ottawa, the Potawatomi, and other Great Lakes people. And I also want to acknowledge the thousands of Native Americans who now call Northeast Ohio home. I am the daughter of Betty Catherine and James Earl, and the great-great-great-great-great-granddaughter of Emma and Priscilla, both of whom were healers and midwives in Grenada, Mississippi. I give honor and thanks to my ancestors whose courage, creativity, and dedication to life, health, and the well-being of the planet, humanity, and all of the living permeates my work and infuses all that I say and do. As I've been thinking about how to bring language to this moment, in a time when we are living and working and trying to be in the throes and the traumas of multiple pandemics, including not only the COVID-19 pandemic, but also the pandemic of racism, spurred on by open acts of white supremacy and increased masculinist militarism. I am reminded of the words of Edwidge Danticat, who wrote in 1994, "I come from a place where breath, eyes, and memory are one, a place from which you carry your past like the hair on your head, where women return to their children as butterflies or as tears in the eyes of the statues that their daughters pray to." I began this evening with an acknowledgement of the land, the ancestral forces that structure our lives, and the recognition of place and breath as vital components of who we are as living beings. For it is the breath that nourishes and replenishes the very embodiment of our aliveness, that connects us to the past, present, and future, to those occupying ancestors and the yet born. It is the breath that gives us energy and the capacity to assert our placefulness, what Howard Thurman refers to as the materializing of vitality in our world. And yet we are here today because of the many forces operating in our world that work to still, obstruct, to extinguish that very breath. The words "I can't breathe," uttered by Eric Garner and George Floyd, as police officers choked the lives out of these men as they were living and being in their own neighborhoods. The words "I can't breathe" have become a rallying cry and a radical identification central to Black Lives Matter protests and organizing to bring attention to and demand change in the ways in which dark-skinned people and Black bodies are dealt with in American places and spaces that still have yet to fully reckon with the ways in which racism has structured the U.S. landscape and the ways in which it has been inscribed onto our very bodies. The refrain, "I can't breathe," are words that I imagine connect us across generations of Black experience. I can imagine that the words "I can't breathe" were uttered in diverse tongues and tones in the belly of flavor ships across the horizons of time and space hundreds of years ago. I can imagine the violence and lack of compassion present when Black folks were lynched in the 19th and 20th century and were denied the comfort and aid by family and community members as Black bodies lay in public view as a signal or reminder to other Black folks, this is what happens to you when you don't mind your place. Say their names: Michael Brown, Tamir Rice. The circling to begin to take down Black bodies by denying life-giving breath. Black bodies that during these multiple pandemics are also ravaged by respiratory diseases such as COVID-19 and asthma that only compound the years and centuries of the refrain, "We cannot breathe." As we are paraded and tortured and made to stand naked in the face of brute force, say her name, Anjanette Young. To stand in the sun and rain for hours to exercise the right to vote, our very bodies criminalized for standing and being and sleeping and living and now for offering a drink of water to those in need. The power to diminish, to smother, to extinguish Black vitality or contain it for one's own use, pleasure, or sense of superiority has been a privilege assumed, particularly by white people who feel entitled to control the movement, the action, and the vitality as transmitted through the breath of Black bodies. They are deemed the guardians of racist power structures that are erected to marginalize, contain, and even annihilate Black vitality. In the unpublished essay of Other Spaces, Michel Foucault introduces the term emplacement as a means of describing medieval European spatial organization. These structures of emplacement are, quote, hierarchic ensemble of places, end quote. Places that inscribe binary, oppositional, and hierarchical notions of the sacred and the profane, the protected and the exposed, the natural and the should be displaced. In my work, I use Foucault's notion of emplacement to specifically interrogate what I call masculinist, white supremacist structures of emplacement. This assumes that what resides within us, indeed, breath, eyes, and memory, speaks to who we are as spatial, social, historical beings, and that our social relationships proceed out of the very bodies that we inhabit. Systems of hierarchic oppositions operating in space create sites that inscribe a set of relationships within our world, our living and dying and acting in multiple spaces at multiple times that assign privilege and power and entitlements to those belonging to groups considered normalized or superior, and marginalized groups deemed less valuable as other. The emplacement of gendered and racialized structures has been inscribed on gendered Black bodies and other bodies in plural localities by the white masculinist imagination for centuries. This emplacement creates a culture of enmity in which the privileged and the powerful soothe the irrational fears of poor working and middle-class whites by erecting and engaging in systems of violence and intimidation as a means of controlling the movement, the bodies, the vitality of the devalued other. This culture of enmity is stoked by the propertied elite class of those who control and want to continue to control wealth in this country. This culture is supported by legal and carceral systems, disenfranchisement, and obstacles to political power, and barriers to and denial of educational and healthcare access. Spatially, masculinist and white supremacist structures of emplacement are reinforced by, for example, the placement of Confederate statuary, the waving of Confederate flags and public designations of streets, buildings, bridges, and parks that had been named after or reflect the image of mostly men, but a few women, who have supported or participated in, often militarily, the demand for a system of torture, murder, rape, and theft of Black lives. This culture of enmity, the soothing of fears and rationing of entitlements by the racialized privileged, are rendered by invisibilizing the humanity of the spatial, historical, social lives of the other, and by creating and recreating an alternative reality in which the assertion of Black life and vitality is viewed as an affront to white masculinist identity. We have seen this culture of enmity playing out in places like Ohio, where for-profit prisons are located in white rural communities. Within these carceral sites, the binary pillars of masculinist white supremacy structures of emplacement are alive and well, and mostly poor Black and brown people, Black and brown bodies, are transported from their cities and neighborhoods to be counted among those rural populations for white political advantage, but are otherwise rendered invisible and devalued as persons. Mostly working class white men and women are employed as jailers and controllers of these bodies. This hierarchic setup assures the white masculinist ego that criminality resides in dark-skinned bodies and gives the white working class a role within the white supremacist structures of emplacement. This role is another iteration of the role of the poor and white working class folks as an entitlement of white skin that harkens back to the role of slavers and the so-called, quote, patty rollers. The history of the slaver or patty roller is itself a white ethnic slur against the newer light-skinned immigrants. Their role as agents of the slaveholding class gave them a special place in masculinist white supremacist structures of emplacement, and they operated to capture, detain, and imprison Black people, Black bodies, who were out of place, as a means to protect white property and white economic interests. The worship of the gun and the ability to discharge them into the bodies of dark-skinned people without legal consequences is an ongoing aspiration of white racial ethnics who continue to see dark skin as a threat and who refuse to give up racialized power over the devalued other. In religion, particularly white nationalist Christianity, these binaries and structures of emplacement are sanctified and re-sanctified to further sustain and perpetuate violence against and the sacrifice of the other. God is claimed as the chief arbiter and gatekeeper of these binary oppositions. We are therefore set against each other by the will of the divine. This culture of enmity is perpetuated by our cultural, social, and political institutions. For the God of the binaries are the gods of corporate media, of racialized capitalism, of abusive religion that thrives under the sensationalism of the us versus them battle. Those who sit atop the binary equation see themselves as superior, as normative, and assume control of those deemed other, those who occupy the bottom half of the binary equation. When the binary gods demand a sacrifice, those aligned with the structures of masculinist white supremacy identify an enemy other to target as an act or acts of misdirection and to avoid paying the consequence for the violence a sacrifice demands. It's interesting that this fell on the date of April 22nd, the week in which we heard the decision of the case of George Floyd's killer, Derek Chauvin. In the closing arguments for this case, the prosecution gave the jury permission to displace white masculinist white supremacist structures that would have us believe that those victimized by racial violence are to blame for injury or death, to see another way. The police originally reported that Floyd died of a medical condition, as if the people in that community and all of us who witnessed Floyd's death via social media hadn't seen George Floyd leave this earth after Derek Chauvin's knee and the weight of his body on Floyd's neck for 9 minutes and 29 seconds choked the life out of our brother. And as if we could not conclude this as a direct cause of his death. There has been a great deal of discussion about this outcome. The prosecution's direction to the jury, yes, you can believe your eyes, is in some ways a validation of the Black communal witness. There's been a great deal of discussion as to whether the outcome of the trial is justice or accountability. And I think that's something we have to work through as a community. I think that fundamentally the conviction for me on all three counts is a verdict. It's a judgment. And that judgment is cathartic because it validates the Black communal witness. And it's not that we seek validation, but there's something cathartic about living an existence where what you see is invalidated again and again and again and again. And then we have an outcome that says, we see what you saw. The invalidation of Black witness has been an important plank in the structure of white supremacy. It has been embedded since the founding of our legal system and practices where enslaved Blacks and even free Black people were denied cause in the defense of their own legal rights and were barred from serving on a jury of peers or testifying against whites. The invalidation of the Black communal witness means that Black people have not had the same access to protection under the law. The harming and killing of Black people has been concealed, dismissed, and reinterpreted by way of the multiple machinations that support white supremacy and placement and devalue Black life. The chant, mantra, and protest cry, Black Lives Matter, is an assertion of the validity and power of Black vitality. It is the use of this materializing vitality through demonstrations, protest, movement, and visual culture in place, space, and time that Black Lives Matter protests transgress boundaries and transform public spaces. To give voice to a communal witness that demands accountability to and for Black lives that are valued, sacred, and a people deserving of dignity and respect. Through our eyes, we view and witness the world as it exists all around us. As spatial, social, historical beings, we experience the world in and through our bodies. Black people's experience is entangled in a set of relationships that proceed from our bodies. We are perceived and related to as others perceive us in our bodies. In addition, it is through the eyes, the witness and experiences of Black life that reveals the structures of masculinist, white supremacist emplacement through our very marginality. What Thurman might refer to as a luminosity of darkness. The Black experience, which includes the ways in which the world responds to us, illuminates the inner workings of the structures of emplacement that affect our lives. The COVID-19 pandemic denied us the deniability of the myriad effects of racism in this country. With the country shut down and the trauma and the grieving and the pain we all were suffering together, collectively, we understood more clearly the ways in which the coronavirus pandemic impacted Black people and Black communities in ways that were overwhelming and continue to be. The country was unable to look away from the ways in which racism impacts the lives and in so many ways contributed to the deaths of Black people. The widespread movement of protests across the nation and around the world brought into sharp relief the inequities resident within our national and local health, education, and criminal justice systems. These protests and movements prepared the ground and continue to break through to many in this country who were privileged to remain aloof and bring attention of many who now had no excuse to dismiss what was now the mainstream media's and political leadership's identification of white supremacy during the 2020 election cycle. We were now more directly confronting not only the harm caused by racism, but the urgent and moral responsibility to confront racism as another crisis that, because of social media and community organizing, we understood as being in pandemic proportions. It is the playfulness of Black movement making that is constantly working to displace structures of emplacement that are creating and recreating a greater consciousness and demand for change. The Black Lives Matter movement that arose in response to the acquittal of George Zimmerman and the shooting death of Trayvon Martin as a model of local organizing produced sites of playfulness that created movement and greater awareness of the violence and trauma of extrajudicial killings and the value of Black life. Young people and intergenerational activists organizing in places like Ferguson, where Michael Brown lived, using methods that include the disruption of traffic patterns that signal the insistence that we cannot go on with our everyday lives and ignore the pain, suffering, and death in which we are all complicit. And in doing so, these organizing bodies sacralize the very life of Black people. These series of movements and the use of social media gave increased presence of Black materializing vitality as a vehicle for social change. We saw Colin Kaepernick's protest during the national anthem performed with military flyovers at NFL games, beginning to disrupt the masculine, white supremacist, and militarized structures, continue the tradition of Black protests in professional sports as other NFL players followed suit. Black athletes have individually stepped in and collectively organized to protest the racism and particularly the extrajudicial killings of Black people using their agency, power, and influence. WNBA players led the way in basketball with a league-wide commitment to social justice. The then appointed senator from Georgia and a partial owner for the Atlanta Dream lobbied for the WNBA owners to deny the players this platform, arguing that social justice had no place in the league. But members of the Dream publicly backed her opponent for the Georgia Senate race, our dear brother, the Reverend Dr. now Senator Raphael Warnock, and launched a social media campaign that helped catapult his candidacy. The protests to bring down Confederate statues also intensified. While some states and localities started moving to take down statues that celebrated Confederate leaders, other localities refused or had been slow to move as public debates about the statutes as history and heritage have been ongoing. With George Floyd's public death and torture and the resultant protests, protesters have braved the threat of coronavirus and demanded action. The argument that these statues are benign history or heritage was harder to make by whites who did not want to be seen as associated with white supremacy. Activists in their playfulness exposed the ways in which the placement of these statues were not about history, but about the emplacement of masculinist white supremacist structures intended to threaten and intimidate Black people and maintain white supremacist power. Nowhere was this more evident than in Richmond, Virginia's Monument Avenue, where a large divided boulevard built from military parades and historically lined with houses of the rich has harbored tributes to men who committed treason against the United States and fought and killed for not only the maintenance, but for the expansion of a trade in human trafficking and torture. Bernice Johnson Reagan tells a story of how Black activists gathered in a Southern Black church in the 1960s. When one of the local deputy sheriffs walked in, the voices in the church became hushed, and one could feel the fear take over. But some mother started leading a song, and Regan explains how the song, the running of sound through the bodies of those gathered, reclaimed the space and drove out the fear. The occupation of the Robert E. Lee statue on Monument Avenue was an exercise in the reclamation of national space. The use of dance, word, art, graffiti, and the projection of Harriet Tubman onto the space created an other space, in the words of Charles Long, which displaced masculinist, white supremacist structures of emplacement. Black-centered protests and movements for change demand an identification with the life in the margins in a way that must disrupt the status quo. Bell Hooks describes the illuminating Blackness of protests against racial and class inequities in this way. This is an intervention, a message from that space in the margin that is a site of creativity and power, that inclusive space where we recover ourselves, where we move in solidarity to erase the category colonized, colonizer, marginality as a site of resistance. Enter that space. Let us meet there. Here in these places, the dance and love of Black flesh acknowledges the ways in which breath, eyes, memory are indeed one in our materializing vitalities. The history and memory of Black life and the history and memory of masculinist white supremacist structures of emplacement are entwined with the Black witness and experience of harm and violation and communal movements to displace these death-dealing structures. The movement of Black bodies through space, troubling and transgressing boundaries and imbuing sites of harm with the love of Black flesh has the power to transform sites of harm into emancipatory spaces. As I wrote in From Selma to Ferguson, Embodied Performance, Social Change, and Political Organizing within the United States, within these spaces, we continue to draw upon the Black aesthetic tradition of song, symbol, and structures in moments of crisis, celebration, and communion. These aesthetic resources hold a generative capacity to express multiple and variant meanings across time and space, across generations of Black embodied experience. And they have the capacity to transport participants across boundaries of time and geography. As described earlier, Bernice Johnson Regan, member of the Freedom Singers and founding member of Sweet Honey in the Rock, continues to lift up the ways in which civil rights activists were able to tap into the deep reservoir of African American aesthetic traditions in order to shift internal and external space. The use of sound, moving and echoing and vibrating through individual bodies and through the collective gathering, mobilized communities and the collective testimony witness of the gathered in ways that was important for effective mobilization. 21st century Black-centered protests have continued in that tradition. And in my work, I use Thomas Tweed's concepts that help me to sort of theorize and think about what transpires during these internal and external shifts. Tweed grounds his theory in three aspects of religion. He identifies as positionality, rationality, relationality, and mobility. Positionality speaks to a person's or a community's physical, social, economic, historical, or ideological location. Relationality refers to the kinds of spiritual or social connections and networks valued by persons or groups. And finally, mobility speaks to the physical, psychic, and social movements and crossings that take place on individual and collective levels. The interplay between positionality, right, relationality, and mobility take place within what Tweed refers to as a teleological landscape of space horizon and crossing. The teleological foci within these landscapes involves actions, experiences, and events that transport individuals and groups within or beyond designated spaces or boundaries, and those that transform spaces and persons. For Tweed, space is physical, it's domestic, it's social, but it can also be conceptual and cosmic. The body represents corporeal space, which along with social space can be transformed by religious and social action. Horizons indicate the boundaries that exist or that are perceived between worlds, either physical or cosmic. Persons can be transported beyond these boundaries through ritual performance. Horizon also refers to the perceived personal and social limitations that we construct or that are forced upon us. By crossing boundaries, persons can be transported by way of encounter, or can be transformed by changes in physical, emotional, or political conditions by way of healing, reform, or revolution. African Americans and their allies draw upon the vast resources of Black spirituality and develop ritual and sounds that enable them to transgress the boundaries between the visible and non-visible worlds, to access the powers of divinity and create the needed interior shifts to reclaim agency over their own bodies and the public spaces that they inhabit. As they transgress physical boundaries, Black freedom fighters challenge notions of public space as exclusionary. By confronting Jim Crow, Black people challenged public landscapes and private domains. These spaces became contested spaces that then were transformed by Black bodies laying claim to public streets and private businesses, demanding that they can accommodate all bodies. By way of connection and relationality, Black people joined together and collectively formed a sense of corporate identity and developed collective strategies that enabled them to more fervently claim and demand the right to free movement in these same public and private spaces. Through the mobile acts of marching, praying, singing, African Americans themselves, and at times joining together with other groups, crossed boundaries and brought about changes in location as well as the conditions in which they lived. In this way, they crossed the physical and ideological horizons of segregationist limits and restrictions and launched campaigns of direct action that made public space legally open and available to all. They crossed boundaries. They crossed these boundaries by marching into voter registration offices, courthouses, jails, and onto public roads and spaces while rejecting the cultural debasement of Black bodies and culture. In the 21st century, mass demonstrations organized to protest the deaths of Black women and men and children such as Trayvon Martin, Michael Brown, Eric Gardner, Sandra Bland, Freddie Gray, Tamir Rice, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, in locales such as Sanford, Florida, Ferguson, Missouri, New York, Walter County, Texas, Baltimore, Maryland, Cleveland, Ohio, Louisville, Kentucky, and Minneapolis, Minnesota, at the hands of law enforcement and deputized forces. These acts of protest continue in the tradition and legacy of embodied performances by marchers and demonstrators of past eras. Marching and occupying public squares and movement actions such as Hands Up and the slogan Don't Shoot are performed in videos. The singing of 21st century spirituals, the refrain We Gonna Be All Right, Ray's and Kendrick Lamar's All Right, and extended and tied tributes We Gonna Be All Right. Public demonstrations in the Black Lives Matter campaign works as a means of reclaiming public and visual spaces in order to confront oppressive structures. 20th and 21st century African American activists engage in practices of committing their bodies to challenge their right to safety and dignity within public space and use discursive strategies and ways that transport individuals and groups beyond the confines of boundaries, limitations, fear, and resignation to transform spatial structures. Now, we are in the throes of Jim Crow 2.0 efforts to maintain and strengthen masculinist white structures of emplacement. Voter suppression bills and laws are being passed to curtail the vitality of Black life and mobilization. Stand your ground laws are now being extended into the use of vehicles as weapons to stop Black-centered mobilization, public demonstration strategies. These laws go beyond legitimate self-defense mitigation to extending the power of the white body wherever he, she, they find themselves. New bills are being passed that quote-unquote unlawful protests are now becoming felonies. These bills include denying school loans to those convicted and would bar them from state employment or receiving unemployment benefits or housing assistance. This is the culture of enmity that continues to be perpetuated against Black bodies and penalizes participants in Black-centered protests who mobilize against structures of white supremacy. In the face of crippling pandemics, we have criminalized humane action and compassionate mutual care. As Black and Brown and Native folks turned out in the last election to install saner elected officials, and as the mothers of those who we have lost to extrajudicial killings and other activists have run for and won political office, we are seeing more pushback with regard to legislation that can curtail some of this. A turn to public health as a way to confront racism can also aid us in providing a counterweight to the culture of enmity, which carries no duty to de-escalate, to identify or empathize with the marginalized other. A turn to public health can help us to amplify a demand for a culture of caring for and tending to, with mutual care, the fundamental priority of public engagement. An effective public health strategy must avoid pathologizing those who have been harmed by racism without denying or rendering invisible the agency and accountability of those causing harm. Debates about and the need to think about how do we think about restoration, transformation, justice, punishment, accountability, not only with respect to individuals, but with the communities impacted. This approach must be presented in a way that addresses the multidimensionality of who we are as spatial, social, historical beings. And I'll just give an example. When COVID hit, we were being told to mask up. We were told to socially distance. But what was missing in that moment, it came later and came in specific spaces, was an integrated approach. The approach from a public health standpoint was about the pathology of the disease. But we didn't have a well-integrated way of saying to people who find socially abhorrent the idea that I have to distance myself from my loved one, that I can't touch my mother. I took taking care of my mother, that I can't touch my mother who has dementia, who doesn't understand. So in that moment, I understood that mask wearing and social distancing was a way of care, but we need an integrated way in which to actually approach that and to talk about that for people in the community who are really struggling with what that means to have to distance oneself from another. And we have to think about the ways in which, particularly Black people and people of color, engage in spirituality. We have to think about their cosmological worldview. So for example, when George Floyd was dying, we knew that when George Floyd called out for his mama, his mother, Larcenia Floyd, stepped out from behind the veil of the invisible ancestral realm into George Floyd's sight line. And we need to be able to incorporate that kind of understanding in our public discourse if we are to displace the structures of white supremacist masculinist emplacement. A public health approach to the violence of racism must affirm the sacred social world of Black life and take into account the full human embodied experience and the healing practices of diverse communities and locales. As we commune together to think about how we can marshal the resources at our disposal to save and honor sacred Black life, even as more names continue to be added to the roll. Say their names: Dante Wright and Makia Bryant. We must continue to wrestle with what does it mean to assert a vitality in today's world, as we acknowledge that indeed, we come from a place where breath, eyes, and memory are one, a place from which we carry our past like the hairs on our head, and where the ancestors return to us as butterflies or as tears in the eyes of the statue that adorn the altars before which we pray. Thank you.
Dr. Bostic, can you hear me?
I can't hear Brother Howard. Brother Howard.
You can hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I was just mesmerized there for a while. Such a powerful address. And I thank you so much for your thoughtfulness and for your insights and for your commitments that speak to the moment that we are now living in. So what I would like to do for a few minutes is to have a conversation with you, ask you some questions related to some of the thoughts that you shared with us and some of your analysis, and ask you if have some more engagement with your thinking. And then after that, we're going to open it up to questions from the registrants so that you can have a chance to respond to their questions. First, I want to start off by just bringing to the forefront the umbrella under which this Ohio Mobile Institute is taking place, which is the umbrella of public theology and racial justice, right? So there's a fundamental theological question that is inescapable in a moment like this. And that question is, when we look at all of the realities that you mentioned and that you are pointing to, the inescapable theological question is, and I'll give you two questions. Where is God in all of this? Right? And what the other side of that question is, what does God have to do with racial justice, or just with justice? So I'm going to just put that there before you as a point of departure for our discussion for a few minutes.
Thank you, Brother. And I think in my work, what I focus on is the way in which God shows up through our bodies, through our lives, through our work, through our mobilizing, through our presence. And so for me, the Black body and the Black witness is an expression of divine protest against the structures human beings have erected. And that we know from the ancestral, intergenerational, theological witness of Black people is that we always understood that the God that we need is the God whom we distinguish from the God historically of the slaveholder and now of nationalist Christianity. And the God that we know is a God of justice. And that God continues to call us to justice. And I think the pandemic, the multiple pandemics have brought into sharp relief the consequences of the denial of justice. And, you know, King talked about this all the time, the interrelatedness, that within these binary opposition, this way of thinking of white supremacy, there somehow is this understanding that they will escape the consequences of the ways in which we have defiled the earth and used its resources in unjust ways, the ways in which we violate Black bodies, and that in this pandemic, we see that we are all related. And so God is a God of justice. We've always understood that as a people. And that is why we're motivated to be engaging in the mobilizing of protest strategies to bring into our organizing the witness of a God who demands accountability and justice.
Following up on that response, the way I think about your work and your writing and your insights, I want to ask you, is it possible, or what would you say to my drawing a fundamental organic relationship to spirit and breath, right? So if the focus of this conference, I mean, one of the, you mentioned it in terms of Eric Garner and also George Floyd, the cry, I can't breathe. And we are using that as an entry into a discussion about racism and the our response to it. So part of my thinking is that if we make a connection between breath and spirit, it's important to think about how we nurture spirit to give breath, right? Or how we you know, how we are able to sustain movements for racial justice by nurturing spiritual, by nurturing the spirit, by having a spiritual anchor, by having a way of connecting our breath, our ability to move and to breathe and to live fully as human beings with our spiritual being. So I just wanted to just have your thoughts on that, and we can go from there.
Definitely, there is sort of the groundedness in spirit as breath. I want to make sure that I'm really sort of expressing this as the playfulness. The playfulness of breath for me can only exist in a place in which we eradicate the binaries. So that means the breath and the vitality of who I am cannot exist within the containment of who I ought to be as a woman, and all of that, and that leaves all of us gender, our sexuality. And so when I talk about breath and spirit and playfulness, that means how I show up and present myself in the world as an expression, as a unique expression of divinity, wherever I am, cannot be contained by a normative sense of what and who I ought to be. And so that spiritual grounding has to be wide, has to be able to bubble up into and flow into all of the fabulousness of who we are. So that means, and I think that's true for Black people. I think Black people can be an affront to white sensibilities when we show up with the array of our skin tones, with the array of our hair texture, with the array of our bodies, with our various expressions, by the way that we move and dance and walk, by the way we occupy a space when we stand and demand attention. And so the spirit is that expression of divinity in its multiplicity. And the Black church has to deal with this too, because there's space in the Black church where we are burdened by the binaries that we continue to perpetuate and demand that the unique divinity of the people we serve fit into a narrow and confined way of being. So I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, well, I want to just continue the conversation by locating the idea that about binaries, right?
Mm-hmm.
Particularly when it comes to how we think about our way of being in the world. So for instance,
Mm-hmm.
there's a notion that comes out of, one of my students brought it to my attention the other day, that comes out of the liberation theologies in Latin America, and also is found expression in liberation theologies in this country, which is the notion of praxis. And this is an idea that we have a tendency to separate thought and action, or we have a tendency to separate what we believe from what we do, right? So a way of talking about talking about that is, do we walk the talk, or do we actually live out our faith commitments in a way that gives expression to the God of justice, right? That you're speaking about.
Mm-hmm.
And also so that's one of the ideas that is flowing through this weekend, is not only about how we talk about these issues, but what do we do about them, right? So that kind of will be something that flows into the Saturday session, where we look at the practical implications of the issues that we're addressing. And I would like to for you, just, and I'm going to end right here with this question and begin to open it up to the wider audience, is in reading I was reading some of your writing, and I was struck by an idea, a concept that you gave expression to, that actually forms that Saturday session in terms of, and also some of the thinking that you shared with us today, is the creation of sacred spaces for emancipatory practices.
Mhm.
I love that construction. And so much of this, of your what you share with us today is about spaces, about space, and how we create sacred space that engenders and nurtures liberatory practices, emancipatory practices. So I just, now let me say this, so I'm gonna make this my last, so you can tie this into. I thought about this in a way too, because you've written about beloved community too. So part of this is about creating community. And I was thinking about this question in relationship to a concept that the German theologian had, Paul Tillich, about the center of our concern, right? And so for us this weekend, the center of our concern is justice, racial justice, right? But then Howard Thurman, the African-American theologian and mystic, talks about broadening the circle of our concern, right? So I'm thinking in terms of how we identify the center of our concern and at the same time broaden our circle of concern. Because another part of what we're doing in the panel discussions tomorrow is looking at the interlocking systems and structures of oppression. So we can't deal with racism without dealing with sexism and patriarchy. And we cannot deal with and heterosexism, and we cannot deal with class without dealing with gender, and we cannot deal with economic exploitation without dealing with political disenfranchisement that is happening across the board right now. So those are a number of things I'm throwing out there, but I'm going to end it there, and then open it up to the wider audience.
Okay, so I'm responding. Okay, so I think when we talk about the center of one's concern, it reminds me of a term we used to use. What is your gospel imperative? So the center of your concern is that which frames how you interpret your understanding of what it means to be, of what is community, and what kind of God it is that you serve, that you follow. And so the center of one's concern, or the gospel imperative, is the ground of how you see the world. So if your gospel imperative is when Jesus stands up and says, reads the scroll of Isaiah, the Spirit of the Lord has anointed me to preach the gospel, good news to the poor, et cetera, et cetera. If that's your gospel imperative, then the multiplicity of the Bible, you are reading through the lens of that imperative. And so when you get to those parts where there's a hierarchical frame that actually is coming from the Greco-Roman culture onto the love and the relationality of the followers of Jesus, then it's your gospel imperative that will enable you to look at that scripture in terms of how you actually would think about it in praxis. I remember one of my colleagues saying, Black folks are good at skipping over the noxious stuff. There's a way in which, this is Howard Thurman's grandmother, right, who couldn't read, and Howard Thurman would read to her, and one day he got up and asked you, he was like, why won't you let me read anything from the Pauline letters? And she said to him, I said, I promise God that if I ever got free to learn to read, I'd never read anything Paul wrote. And so what she was saying in that instance is, because the masters who would allow preaching to happen, it would always be slave, be submissive to your masters, because they wanted to protect their property, so-called. And so the center of our concern really speaks to the priority that we seek. And so when we seek to actually widen that concern, is the center of our concern, is it flexible enough to include all of us. I mean, if your center of concern is everybody who don't think like me is going to hell, then you're you have a very narrow, sort of community in terms of why you think about that. So I'm sorry, but there's some folks who that's the center of how they think about religion. And what's the other part that you asked me about? Creating sacred space. And so part of marking sacred space, again, is bringing the authenticity and the power of who we are. Bernice Johnson Reagan said, not only do we sort of have people trying to suppress who we are, but oftentimes, it's difficult for us to actually express all of who we are. And so that space has to look like what we're trying to create. So we're trying to create beloved community, that sacred space, the language that we use, the items that we bring in, has to invite and nurture and honor all those whom we would bring in. But also as the person who's bringing, this goes back to your other question about spirit. And in part, what we, especially as ministers, bring is hopefully, if we're prayed up, is the ability to connect or mediate between worlds. So the spirituality I'm actually grounding my work in is sort of the ways in which we understand as Black people, what does it mean when we have mediators who connect us to the invisible world? That's why I mentioned George Floyd's mother. So that's what you need to create spaces where, because Black people need to hear from that other world so that we know what we need to do, what our charge is, what we need to correct. That's the whole foundation of Africana religions infused through Christianity is, are we all right with each other? Are we all right with mama and daddy and whoever who's gone on? Are they trying to tell me something? It's an epistemology in which we want to know what's down the street and around the corner. We can't see it, but if I can connect to the other side, somebody's going to give me some help to help me to avoid that which I'm trying to avoid so I can proceed out of the center and include everybody. So that's why I talk about the Black sacred social world. It is that a relationality. It's a living in the dead. It's a yet born. We're trying to make sure that we're doing right by all these folks because we know what the consequences are when we don't.
Yeah.
Get that, my short answer.
And for future generations.
Yes.
Right. I want to bring Dr. Smallwood into this conversation. I have received a couple of questions that I will share with you, but I want to give priority to Dr. Smallwood right at this point.
First of all, I just want to say thank you so very much. That was invigorating. And I just loved the poetic end. And I was hoping that you would expound upon that, and you just did, but I still want to keep you there for just a minute or two. Because what I heard you say was this whole idea of ancestral space, right? Mm-hmm. This notion that there is a return that happens. And we're not far from that concept, but we try to distance ourselves because of westernized ways of thinking. Mm-hmm. But Walter Fluker invoked this as well in his book about the ground has shifted, this notion that we really do need to tap into and maybe call some of those people in the great cloud of witnesses because mm-hmm. they can lead us, they can be guides. I often think of people like Eliza Woods, who was completely and totally killed for no reason, mm-hmm. hung from a tree, and she knew she wasn't guilty. 3 years later, mm-hmm. the man who killed his wife admitted it because he under the pressure of it all. And I feel that Eliza Woods is a guide to those of us who know people who have been wrongly accused, but we don't tap into that. And so my question mm-hmm. has to do with this idea of George Floyd having his mother in his sightline. Because apart from temporal spatiality, we need to have eyes that see beyond the physicality and the materiality. And when we develop those eyes, that then gives us a level of power, wouldn't you say, that we're not operating in?
Well, part of my argument is the other side is coming through in us when we are materializing our vitality. So that's part of it. But what you and Dr. Smallwood and Reverend Wiley are pointing to, and I think that that's something we need to think about, is how are we equipping people to be able to access that, to be able to master is the wrong word, but to be able to grow in the sense of how we actually navigate. And that goes back to your question, I think, Reverend Wiley, about creating sacred space. And I think we don't have enough spaces where we train each other for that kind of work, right? And so people are kind of a bit lost about how to do that. But the thing about it, the thing that I believe is, if you are committed, the ancestors are gonna come through. There's things that we can do to access. I got a candle burning in front of Priscilla and Emma right now, because I'm like, I need y'all today. So that's the thing that we need to learn. And that's what I was saying about COVID, is that if we're going to take a public health, we can't do, I mean, Fauci and those guys were great, but they only talked about or could talk from the standpoint of the pathology of the disease. You got to talk to Black folks regarding, well, what does it mean in terms of my communal relationships? How do I navigate this in terms of my spirituality? How do I counter the trauma and the disconnect? What are the tools, resources, practices that I can engage in that are going to help me through this crisis so that I can come out in my right mind? And so part of that is learning how and taking seriously what it means to engage. That's why I went off on Facebook one time because this thing that's going around about I'm not my ancestors, and I got a strong feeling from the other side. I said to people in my family, take that down off your wall. I'm telling you, it's not because of how I feel about it. You need the ancestors. If you're going to stand up to somebody who wants to kill you, you want those ancestors right there. You don't disown them. And to me, again, it's another trick to have us disown and have enmity toward one another versus being connected. And folks got, younger folks got, but that's not what I mean. I'm like, I don't even know who made this T-shirt up. I don't even know who it is. But you need to take that down. If you want to stand and fight somebody, say that. But don't say you are not your ancestors. And it also says you don't know as much about history because you don't know the ways in which folks have fought and the things that they have sacrificed, et cetera. And so that's part of the multiplicity, is we have to stop telling each other, although I'm telling them, of course, but I'm grown, so I'll do that. We have to stop telling each other that you can only do this the way I do this. That's one of the things I have to do in the institution. Is there are people who play Hunger Games in the academy. I want this, I want that. I had to tell somebody the other day, and I practice humility. I usually don't say stuff, but I had to tell them, I need you to understand. I'm not playing Hunger Games. I'm playing three-dimensional chess. I'm in here for the long game. There are things that are in place because I worked over time, and you don't see my fingerprint on them because I worked in so many different levels and ways, and I saw down the street like, okay, we need this person in place if we're gonna make this happen. And so I don't strike down people who want to be in your face because I think you need all of it. And we need to stop telling each other there's only one way to move. I'm not that person. I'm a turtle. I'm determined, and I don't like people pushing me because I need to see, I need to hear, I need to observe so that I understand the whole picture so I know how to act. Don't tell me what I got to do right now because I'm not going to do it till the spirit say do it. Anyway. I'm on a vent. Let me
Actually, you're not. And this is my final point. Actually, you're not on it. You right on it. Because honestly, a lot of us have failed to conclude that we are in a spiritual warfare, and we cannot invoke the wrong weapons. We have to invoke the correct weapons, the ones that are mighty and powerful. But we can't, resort to arms. That's not the point, right? But we have the capacity to fight this war. It is not by happenstance that we had a young baby girl shot the same day the verdict came down. It's not by happenstance that young brother in Columbus is shot down in December. Not by happenstance, that Casey Goodson was shot that day, or that Devontae Wright was shot in the same locale. These are spiritual attacks, and you can't fight it with the wrong stuff. I mean, the justice system is fine. I worked it for 20 plus years, but it's not the whole answer. Thank you so much.
Yeah, and I have a question thank you, Dr. Smallwood. I have a question from Facebook and one in the chat room, but I want to say this too, in terms of what Dr. Smallwood just said. There's a point, Dr. Bostic, that we just can't move from one outrage to another perpetually. You know what I mean? I mean, and definitely we can't do it. We can't sustain any form of struggle without some type of spiritual anchor. Just within the last few days, it's like it's every other day we're moving from one outrage to another, So in terms of social justice and social transformation, and also in terms of creating emancipatory spaces, because and also broadening the circle of concern, right? So you see you see coalitions and alliances and collaboration between people that are emerging that require, I think you use, crossing boundaries and breaking down barriers, and people not operating in silos as separate from, as if the struggles that we're engaged in are not connected, right? So part of the question before us too is like how we embrace emerging forms of spirituality that aren't really traditionally defined or readily embraced because they aren't what we did before, and also emancipatory spaces that are also requiring a different way of understanding what sacred is in terms of space, right? So let me ask this question as a follow-up to that. It's a question from Facebook. Dr. Bostic, could you say more about the concept of emplacement and how it works today?
So the concept of emplacement is about how structures are erected which express and maintain opposition. So it really speaks to what's protected and what's not, what's normative and what's not. And so that becomes a problem. You can't fit all the folks in the world into two, you over here and you over there. That's not, we're complex. We're diverse. If we would really believe that we're made in the image of God, and there's a diversity, there's such a massive diversity of who we are and who we be. And so emplacement is about those structures that maintain those kinds of confines. So when I talk about masculinist, white supremacist structures, I'm talking about ideological, legal, social, theological concepts and practices that maintain not the binaries, but the enmity. It maintains us othering each other. I mean, we're at this point in our culture right now where if you don't think exactly like I think, I want to annihilate you. I mean, that's where we are. I mean, and that's particularly, and I usually don't talk about parties, but right now we are in a time where the Republican Party is really showing up as a Jim Crow party. I mean, in a deep way. Of course, there are those within that, who may be more moderate and more, et cetera, but at this point, they have pretty much gone there. And so the ways in which people believe, if you don't think like me, I mean, they're not even, they don't even have a national kind of allegiance. And so emplacement is about how we continue to engage in those set of relationships. So for Black people, it means like the stereotypes, the criminalizing of Black people. So when you see a Black person, you think they're criminal. So you think whatever you do is justified in that moment. That's an ideological structure of emplacement. But emplacement is like, these are the things that are placed that keep us stuck in this kind of the violence against trans women, Black and brown trans women, is about what we think gender and sexuality and expression ought to be. And, we have to ask ourselves, why is it my business how somebody else is living in the world? What does that mean to me? So I don't know if I've lost your other point about spirituality. And that's the other piece, is that's why I think I located in the body and divinity and sacrality in that way, because that gets us beyond doctrine and those kinds of specifics. What it says is divinity is expressed through me by my very creation. I mean, if you're a Christian, you believe God creates human beings in God's own image. And we know when people are showing up in their authenticity. And what we do is we demand that people show up in forms that make us feel comfortable versus their own authenticity. And what emplacement does is it penalizes and judges those who don't show up according to the set binaries. And we can't do that.
Dr. Bostic, Howard, can you hear me? Brother Wiley, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. I can hear you.
I'm Larry Little. I'm one of the original members of the Black Panther Party in North Carolina. And I've listened to your lecture. I was inspired by it. You brought a lot of good ideas. And I just wanted to say it makes an old man like me realize that I can retire because they're young, intelligent, powerfully intelligent, beautiful women like yourself who are going to carry on this struggle. So I just wanted to say from an old rebel, continue to do your research, continue to work. And we used to say in the Panthers that social practice is the criteria for the truth. You must integrate your theories with practice to see whether or not it works. And you make adjustments. So we just can't be theoretical. We must integrate theory with practice. And then we see how we go from there. So I won't say much more, but I just wanted to let you know I'm very proud of you and the young people like yourself who are thinking and being a part of the struggle. And in the Panthers, we saw a need to defeat racism and capitalism with a rainbow coalition. That's why Fred Hampton was murdered, because he pulled together a rainbow coalition of people. I was with Fred Hampton 2 weeks before he was murdered. And we were in Berkeley, California at the national headquarters. And it was interesting because Fred told me he didn't want me to come back to the South because he thought I couldn't survive. He said the racism in the South is much worse he felt, and there was no distinction between the Klan and the police. But I told him if we were going to be the vanguard party and the majority of Black people in the South, we could not postpone organizing the South. And 2 weeks later, Brother Fred Hampton, and he said these words to me, he said, we have a base of support in Chicago right now, and only one Panther has been killed. And 2 weeks later, he was murdered. So I think we can't do it alone as Black people. There are allies, and there have always been allies, like John Brown, Goodman, Sherman, Valauso, and we have to incorporate it. And I feel so good because the young people, even in the space of this pandemic, they said, we must not just fight this pandemic, we must fight the pandemic of white supremacy. And these young people got out here and they fought and they organized. And I just smiled when I saw it, because I said, the young people, they're going to make this revolutionary movement and they're going to keep it strong. So thank you for just your indulgence of me. Thank you, Cal.
Well, thank you so much, Brother Little. I mean, that's part of Reverend Wiley's question about how you create these spaces. And we create these spaces through collective engagement.
Yes.
You talk about the Black Panther Party in terms of education, in terms of feeding the community, et cetera. And yeah, when you talk about the culture of enmity and the binaries, Fred Hampton was talking to white Appalachian folks and
Right.
folks and Black folks in the city, really was moving to overcome that, the ways in which the wealth, the elite were trying to keep us apart from one another, when in fact, I mean, this is, what so many folks are trying to really focus on right now is, the identification that we have actually on the same issues. And so part of so what you're saying, what you're speaking to is a long arc of hope.
Yes.
Is that we, I thought about some of those old guard folks in Congress and in the Senate who, when things started coming out after the 2016 election, I said, how do they feel like we fighting the same fight? But it's a spiral, not, we're not in the same place, but we have to remain vigilant because those forces remain and we have to keep pushing. And as you said, that's what young people did. At a time where people couldn't turn aside, they pushed through even more in terms of helping people to see these structures and the way in which they impact all of us. And so, Reverend Wiley, we sort of talk about these intersections. This is what we know. This is what our indigenous brothers and sisters tell us when they're protecting the waters. Like, we're all going to be impacted by all of this. You can think that this only impacts a particular community. And certainly, people who are vulnerable bear a great deal of it. But this earth is going. I have friends who said we have to be careful saying like we can destroy the Mother Nature. I'm like, well, no, we can't destroy Mother Nature, but we can make this planet inhabitable for us because they can get rid of us.
You're absolutely right.
If we don't take care of it, but the fact that we don't think that we ought to take care of our home, it's something again that we've created and erected these barriers. So the practice and praxis of communal engagement is the place where the sacred and the spirit arises out of. And so that engagement and that collective relationality is how we keep that spirit alive. And it's that coming together and that's honoring of all of those who are in the space who do have justice as a goal, and the openness to be able to express, to be able to accept the different kinds of spiritualities that people bring to the table that ground and anchor and empower them.
Yes, yes. I agree.
I have a friend, I work with women in Harlem, and there was a Muslim woman who would come to some of our group meetings, and she was using all kinds of modalities of healing. I said, well, how do you reconcile this, with your practice of Islam? And she said, honey, I use whatever works. So if you want to talk about that center, Reverend Wiley, her center was Black women are suffering, they need to be healed. And whatever I can use that will heal them, I am not going to not use it because it doesn't fit, the doctrine or the expectations, of a particular, so she had that flexibility, because her point wasn't, her belief even, it was, well, how can these women be healed? And I'm gonna leave you with Velma from one of my formative books, and one of my literary ancestors, Toni K. Bambara, in the book The Salt Eaters, where she says to Velma, who has tried to commit suicide because she's just sacrificed and has given all that she can to the cause of the struggle of freedom, and she's sitting there and they're trying to work with her, and she says, "Are you sure, sweetheart, you want to be made well?" And she says, "I just want to caution you because there's a lot of weight when you're whole or when you're well." And so that's the weight. And that's what Reverend Wiley, you're talking about. We need a spirituality that can anchor us so that we can do the work that we need to do. We need multiple kinds of ways of approaching activism. And we need to hold each other in that diversity. Everybody doesn't have to do the same thing. Everybody can't do the same thing. And so we need people working in various and diverse ways. And we need to continue the work that is before us. And you're right with Brother Little, there are so many folks who are standing up now. I mean, I'm from Fort Wayne, Indiana, and there was a little protest in my little city, and it was all young white people, because we have such a low Black population. And I was like, you mean they're protesting? They're having a Black Lives Gathering in Fort Wayne, Indiana? Yes. And so when you see that all over the world, when after the 2016 or 2017 inauguration, I would take care of my mother. Women came and took care of my mother so I could take a day trip to DC. And we were looking all over the world, women in Denver, women, across the country who were gathering to demonstrate against the massive white supremacist ideology that was coming into the White House. And so we are awakened in a way that that can propel us forward. But as Reverend Wiley is saying, is what is the work that we're doing now on the ground that we can sustain?
And when you come together, all over the world, you're creating sacred spaces when you're strategizing, and organizing on how we advance the struggle for liberation. Yeah. That is creating the sacred spaces. Mm-hmm.
That's the vitalizing energy that continues to sustain us, yes, and bring us together, yes, to do the work that God is calling us to do.
Yes. Dr. Little?
Yes, my brother.
Yeah, thank you for your contribution.
I'll shut up.
You don't have to shut up. I just want to get a question from the chat room, and then I want Dr. Smallwood to close us out. I think we're nearing the end of this wonderful session. And I just, when I take this question, I'm gonna say a few words, Dr. Smallwood, and then I'm gonna turn it over to you. Okay, the question is, Shatika, do you have that question? It's about how do you shape the students at Case Western to become involved in how do you hope to, I'll read it exactly. How do you hope to mold and shape the social justice thinking of your students at Case? And the end of that question says Republicans are, are trying to make protesting a felony. Mm-hmm. That's the question. Mm-hmm. And we'll end with that question. Mm-hmm.
So again, there are multiple ways to protest. I mean, one of the ways I know, one of the things that will be happening is sort of testing those new legislation in terms of taking it through the court system. And so in a case, we have the social justice system. Aisha the Hardaway is in the law school. And I know there are folks already lined up to begin to push back against the constitutionality of these kinds of laws, because there are specifically they're specifically drawn to provide barriers to strategies that Black Lives Matter protests use. Now, we've just seen the insurrection at the White House, and we've not seen legislation that is specifically geared toward that. And so I think that for me, the question just left. For me, we do it on multiple levels. First of all, we have to begin to challenge these notions of emplacement that are taking up the minds and the thinking of our students. They're coming from various places. And so in our coursework and in our community work, we are confronting one another and challenging one another with the way in which we think about this binary thinking, the ways in which we still incorporate stereotypes. I mean, the other piece of this, you're talking about sort of interconnection is, for example, the targeting of Asian Americans and the ways in which the violence against Asian Americans related to the way in which the coronavirus has been structured. So it's through our coursework, it's through our community engagement, but it's also engaging students on different levels of challenging these laws. And so I imagine that Black Lives Matter protesters are going to continue to use these strategies, or they may shift. But I think there are so many models and tools and ways to approach it. And I think what we're doing is educating, and then also bringing students together so that they can speak to so they can bring their own ideas and their own thoughts about how they want to protest and bring about change. So there are so many ways through art, through performance, through public protest, as well as through legal challenges, that there are many students who are already in place who can participate in a multiplicity of efforts.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bostic. And I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Smallwood to close us out. I just want to say that there is a link in the chat box, I think you call it a box, the chat box that I put there. It's a CDC website resource, and that focuses on racism and public health. And it's a good resource for the kind of thinking and strategizing that we're going to be doing. You go ahead, Dr. Bostic.
I also want to say a very important thing is how we model for our students and for other people. How do we engage in relationships with one another? What kind of leadership styles do we use? Are we replicating some of these hierarchical, abusive ways of being, or are we really working toward thinking about how we relate to one another and how we model what it means to be about justice? So that's a very important piece too, that we have to sort of look at and engage and know that none of us can be perfect, but are we working to really do that? And how are we standing in the gap when others may be crossing the line to protect others in our community?
Yeah. And thank you. And let me say this, again, just reinforce that there's a link in the chat that you can go to that will make available sources that deal with really good sources that deal with racism and public health. I also want to just remind people that then Dr. Smallwood will tell us what's ahead of us at this point, but we have 2 more days. We have 2 panel discussions tomorrow. Dr. Smallwood will give specifics on that. And and then we'll have a talk back session on Saturday morning that will focus on creating sacred spaces for emancipatory practices. Yeah, and another part of this, Dr. Bostic, is your vision of, and us, a vision that we can begin to at least imagine a different future, right, than the one that than the present that we're engaged in, I mean, that we're experiencing. And so part of that is asking the question as we go forward. We're dealing with the injustice. So the question that we want to move toward, what does justice look like? I mean, how do we imagine a different future? I was thinking about like the two things about sacred spaces, and also about your comments about music and art, and the role that that plays in giving expressions to our spiritual power. When you, I've heard that story, Bernice Reagan talk about the church, and when the people, the police came into church and they started singing, and just the power of music and the kinds of things that young people have done creatively in front of police lines and everything, dancing and singing, and the kind of resistance that comes through art. So in that vein, we're going to have a group from Cleveland, Hue people, vocal ensemble Hue people, that will be performing between the panel discussions tomorrow on Friday, and also they will lead off the Saturday morning session with some song. So I think that that's part of trying to continue that tradition, that legacy of art and performance and music as being expressions of spiritual and actual concrete resistance. Okay, Dr. Smallwood, thank you.
So I just want to say again how thankful I am to you, Dr. Joy Bostic, for giving us a roadmap tonight, for giving us the praxeological approach, where we take our theories and we make them walk for us and talk for us the same way we understand Jesus does for us in the garden. And in the gardens of our hearts, we hope that naming this particular conference, We Can't Breathe, Racism as a Moral, Spiritual, and Public Health Crisis, helps us to understand and to break open the importance of us being as a community capable of the complex and critical thinking we must do in order to have a justice platform. Because what we were taught tonight about the masculinist and white supremacist structure of emplacement is precisely why we now see 243 areas trying to suppress our vote, trying to put legislative things in place to keep us from handing each other a cup of water. Now, if you go down to EJI's museum for lynching, you'll find out that many of our ancestors were lynched simply because they got a drink of water from somebody's spring. So understand where these narratives are coming from. And when you can theorize where the narrative comes from, you'll take the narrative out of your mouth that is antithetical to your breath, so that you can breathe, and not only breathe, but move and have your being. I'm looking forward to what will happen the next 2 days. Tomorrow morning, we'll be assembled with a panel that will discuss race and gender. It'll be moderated by Reverend Kimma Cunningham and paneled by Bishop Marcia Dinkins, Dr. Terrence Dean, Bishop Jerome McCory, and Reverend Dr. Susan K. Williams-Smith. And then after that, the Hue people will give us a concert from noon to 1. We'll go directly into the second panel that'll be moderated by Reverend Gerald A. Cooper, Esquire. And that will be paneled by Dr. Tajay Beulah, Reverend Dr. Myla P. Cooper, Dr. Zachary Williams, and Mr. Randall McShepard. Now, as you go this evening, please plan to be with us. And if you want more information about who is now talking in this nation, about how racism is a moral and a spiritual and a public health crisis. I'm putting something in the chat that you can take a look at. And you can go to our website. I put that in the chat as well. Our website will give you more information on the people who will appear in these panels and also connectivity information for those who have appeared even tonight. I bid you Godspeed and I thank you so much. For if we attend to the life of the mind, we can handle the life of the body. Good night.